The heavy smell of expensive perfume and stale rain clung to my skin as I stared at my reflection in the dark mahogany paneling of the lounge. My eyes were wide, pupils blown with a terror I couldn't mask no matter how many times I'd practiced looking calm in mirrors. My fingers brushed the silk of my crimson gala dress, specifically where the fabric had torn at the shoulder, a reminder of Donald's grip before I'd bolted. 5 years of being the O'Brien trophy had turned me into a ghost, a hollowed-out version of a woman, fleeing a high society gala with nothing but a stolen thumb drive stitched into my cardigan lining and the frantic hope that the city would swallow me whole. Outside, the rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the lounge, blurring the neon city lights into jagged streaks of gold and red. The jazz in the background was supposed to be smooth, but it scraped against my nerves like something discordant and wrong. Every time the heavy brass doors groaned open, I flinched, expecting to see Donald's polished Oxfords and that clean, photogenic smile he wore like armor. The one that had fooled every journalist, every city official, every person who had ever looked at us and seen a power couple instead of a warden and his property. I pulled my cardigan tighter across my chest, trying to disappear into the dim corner of the booth. Nobody in this amber-lit sanctuary noticed a woman in a red dress sitting like she was waiting to be struck. The lounge doors swung open with a heavy thud, and a group of men in dark jackets stepped inside. My heart stopped, panic surged, and as I tried to press deeper into the shadow of the booth, my elbow caught the glass of bourbon I hadn't touched. Tipped, the amber liquid rolled in a slow, inevitable wave across the dark wood, and directly into the hand of the man sitting at the far end of the same long table. A hand I hadn't noticed until this moment. Large, steady, tattooed across the knuckles in ink so dark it looked carved rather than drawn. "It's just a drink," a voice said. I froze. Came from low in the chest, not loud, but the kind of deep that doesn't need volume. The kind that travels through walls and floors and the base of your spine without asking permission. I forced myself to look up. The air left my body in one silent rush. He wasn't just a man. He was the kind of thing that gets built when the world stops apologizing for what it makes. Broad shoulders packed into a black coat that fit him the way a second skin fits. Not tailored so much as inevitable. Dark hair, sharp at the edges. A beard kept close, precise. And a tattoo that began somewhere beneath his collar and traced up toward his jaw like a sentence the rest of the world wasn't cleared to finish reading. His eyes were heavy-lidded and the color of a road at midnight. Not black, but the deep, lightless gray of a sky before it decides what kind of storm it wants to be. He wasn't looking at my face. He was looking at my wrist, where my cardigan sleeve had ridden up, exposing the purple, hand-shaped bruise Donald had left 63 minutes ago in the coat room of his own gala. Something moved across the man's features. Not pity, not curiosity. Something that had no softness in it at all. Something that simply registered the information and began calculating. "Thank you," I whispered, pulling my sleeve down, reaching for a napkin, trying to rebuild the invisible walls I'd spent 5 years perfecting. Instead of standing to leave, he shifted in the booth. He didn't move toward me, and yet his presence suddenly expanded to fill every cubic inch of air between us. A scent drifted over. Sandalwood, expensive tobacco, and something metallic underneath it all, like rain on iron. "You're vibrating," he observed. Not unkindly, not kindly, simply as a man states a fact he has already decided is his business. "I'm cold," I said. The rain. His gaze moved, unhurried, deliberate, from my wrist to my face. Whatever he found there made him reach, without ceremony, for the heavy black coat draped across the back of the booth. He slid it across the table toward me. Asterisk, put it on. Asterisk. It was not an invitation. Every instinct I had left screamed at me to stand up, to walk out, to disappear into the storm before this man could become one more thing I had to survive. Instead, I draped the coat over my shoulders. It was warm, impossibly, unreasonably warm, and it smelled entirely of him, and for one disorienting moment I felt something I had not felt in 5 years. Like something was standing between me and the cold. Asterisk. Where are you going, Red? Asterisk, he asked, leaning back with the kind of ease that belongs to men who have never once had to justify taking up space. Away, I whispered. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to one, like a man who finds something genuinely interesting for the first time in a long while. Dangerous direction, he said. Asterisk. For someone who doesn't know how to run. Asterisk. Before I could answer, the lounge door opened again. This time the sound of it was different, heavier, deliberate. I knew without looking. I always knew. 5 years had made me an expert in the particular quality of air that preceded Donald's men. I started to rise, legs already liquid beneath me. Sit, the man beside me said. He didn't look at the door. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said the word, and something in the register of it nailed my feet to the floor. I looked at the enforcer who had stopped in the middle of the room, scanning, hunting, and then I looked at the man beside me. And I understood, with the kind of clarity that only arrives at the bottom of genuine terror, that I had not sat down next to a stranger. I had sat down next to Dallas or Townsley, and the enforcer across the room had just realized the same thing. The man stopped walking. He didn't reach for anything. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, recalculating, color leaving his face in a slow, visible tide. Dallas didn't look at him. He looked at me. Eyes steady, unhurried, as though the outcome of the next 60 seconds had already been decided and he was simply waiting for the room to catch up. You're in the shadow of this booth now, he said, voice dropping to something that moved beneath the jazz like a current beneath still water. Asterisk, and in this shadow, even the men Donald O'Brien sends go quiet. Asterisk. My phone buzzed in my clutch. I pulled it out on instinct and felt my blood turn to ice. Donald's name lit the screen, white and clean and absolute, the way his control over my life had always been. Seamless, inevitable, inescapable. Before I could think, before I could breathe, Dallas's hand reached across the table and plucked the phone from my fingers with the bored precision of a man disarming something beneath his notice. He glanced at the screen. Then he looked at me, and something shifted in those midnight eyes. Not surprise, recognition. His thumb moved to the answer button. Let's see, he said quietly, asterisk, what the golden man wants. Asterisk. The car didn't take her somewhere she recognized. It moved through the city like it owned the road, and perhaps it did because nothing stopped it. No light held it long. No other vehicle drifted into its lane. Maureen sat rigid against the leather, the coat still around her shoulders, watching the city rearrange itself outside the rain-streaked window. The neighborhoods changed the way depth changes when you dive. The familiar surface giving way to something darker and more pressurized the further down you went. The boutique storefronts and gallery awnings dissolved into steel and concrete. Glass towers that reflected nothing. Buildings that didn't advertise what happened inside them. Dallas hadn't spoken since the lounge. His phone had been at his ear for most of the drive. his voice low and clipped in a register that wasn't designed for her ears. She didn't try to listen. She sat with her hands folded in her lap like a woman in a waiting room, which was, she supposed, exactly what she was. The car descended into a subterranean garage that looked less like parking and more like the anteroom of something classified. The gates sealed behind them with a sound like a vault, a single hydraulic exhale of finality. Two men in dark clothing appeared from nowhere, moving to the car with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this 10,000 times and expected to do it 10,000 more. They didn't look at her directly. They looked around her, cataloging the space she occupied, and she understood instinctively that she had just become something to be accounted for in a system she didn't yet understand. The elevator was brushed steel and silence. It moved fast. Her ears adjusted to the pressure as they climbed, and she watched her own reflection in the metal doors. A woman in a ruined crimson dress, a borrowed coat swallowing her shoulders, her hair half collapsed from whatever the rain had done to it. She looked like wreckage being transported somewhere for assessment, which was, she supposed, also accurate. The doors opened and she stepped into his world. It wasn't what she expected, though she couldn't have said what she'd expected. The penthouse stretched before her in dark glass and matte charcoal walls that absorbed the city light rather than reflecting it. The ceilings were high, not grandly, palatially high, but high in the way of a space designed to give a large man room to think without his thoughts bouncing back at him. The furniture was precise and minimal, each piece chosen for function rather than comfort. A long, low sofa the color of slate. A desk that looked like it was made from something that had survived a war. No rugs that weren't necessary. No art that wasn't structural. No photographs. Not a single one. She crossed to the center of the room slowly, her heels marking the dark wood floor with soft, deliberate clicks, and turned in a slow arc. The windows ran floor to ceiling on three sides, and the city burned below them. A million lights that looked, from this height, like something controlled, like something that could be switched off. The glass was thick. She could see it in the slight distortion at the edges, the way the rain outside moved differently against it than ordinary windows. It wasn't there to frame a view. It was there because it could withstand pressure that ordinary glass couldn't. Everything in this room could withstand pressure that ordinary things couldn't. She turned back and found Dallas watching her from the entryway. His coat removed now, jacket gone, the holsters at his ribs visible and entirely matter-of-fact. He was watching her the way she'd seen him watching the enforcer in the lounge, with patience, and with the particular stillness of a man who was also simultaneously calculating. "It's not a cage," he said. He said it the way people say things they've said before to people who needed to hear it, which told her it was probably not entirely true. "I know what a cage looks like," she answered. Asterisk. "I've been living in one for 5 years. Asterisk. Something moved across his expression. Not quite acknowledgement, not quite concession. He moved to a cabinet at the far wall and opened it, revealing a row of crystal tumblers and a bottle of bourbon that probably cost more than a month of the rent she'd once paid on the apartment she'd had before Donald. Before all of it. He poured 2 glasses without asking. Set one on the edge of the desk closest to her. Took his own and stood by the windows, his back to the city, his eyes on her. She looked around the room one more time. At the reinforced exits, the surveillance monitors built flush into the wall, the absolute, deliberate absence of anything soft or personal or vulnerable, and understood with a cold, clear certainty the thing Dallas Townsley had never once said aloud. He hadn't built this fortress to keep people out. He'd built it because he had never, not once in his life, felt safe enough to stop. She didn't touch the bourbon right away. She stood beside the desk and looked at the glass the way you look at something offered by a person whose motives you haven't finished reading yet, with want and with wariness in equal measure. Dallas didn't push. He returned to his position by the windows, his own glass held loosely at his side, and he watched the city the way a man watches something he owns but doesn't particularly like. Proprietary, dispassionate. The silence stretched. Outside, the rain continued its assault on the glass. "You cleaned out fast," he said finally, without turning. Most women who run from men like Donald O'Brien take weeks to plan. Months. You left in the middle of his own event, in the dress he put you in, with nothing visible in your hands. He paused. Which means whatever you took small. Maureen said nothing. Now he turned. His eyes moved to the cardigan she still wore beneath his coat. The hidden lining, the slight asymmetry at the left side where the thumb drive sat stitched into the seam. He had clocked it. She didn't know when, but he had clocked it the way he had clocked everything else about her since the moment she'd spilled that glass. "So," Dallas said, and his voice dropped into that low, deliberate register that didn't require volume to fill a room. Why is the city's most powerful developer so desperate to kill his own wife? There it was. The question she had been carrying like a stone at the base of her throat since the night she'd found the files. She had rehearsed 100 versions of how to answer it. Evasions, half-truths, careful framings that revealed just enough to buy protection without surrendering leverage. Every version dissolved now under the flat, patient weight of his attention. He wasn't going to be managed. She understood that the way you understand a structural fact about a building, not as an opinion but as something load-bearing and immovable. She reached into the lining of the cardigan. Her fingernails caught the small seam she'd opened and re-sewn 3 times in the past month, and she worked the thumb drive free with the practiced movement of a woman who had rehearsed this too. She set it on the desk between them without ceremony. Dallas looked at it for a moment. Then he moved to the terminal built into the far wall, flush with the charcoal surface, invisible until activated, and the screen came alive in a wash of cold blue light that made the room feel clinical. He inserted the drive. His fingers moved across the keys with the efficiency of someone who had read documents he wasn't supposed to have many times before. Maureen watched him read. She watched the way his eyes tracked the lines of data, the shipping manifests that didn't match any legitimate cargo, the names paired with vessel numbers and port coordinates, the financial architecture that turned Donald's charitable foundations into conduits for something that had no charitable word to describe it. She watched him move from the surface documents into the encrypted layer underneath, the one that had taken her 4 nights of careful, silent work to access while Donald slept 3 rooms away. She watched for the moment it landed. It didn't land the way things land on ordinary people, with visible shock, with the face rearranging itself around the weight of what it's just received. Dallas didn't recoil. He didn't exhale or press his fingers to his mouth or turn away. His expression didn't crumble. Crystallized. The slight looseness of assessment that had been in his features since the lounge, the watchful neutrality of a man reserving judgment, went away. What replaced it was something harder and more specific. A sharpness that had a direction to it now. She had seen that quality in his face when he'd looked at her bruised wrist, but this was larger. This was the face of a man who had just confirmed the size and shape of a thing he was going to have to address. He removed the drive. He held it for a moment, the small silver rectangle sitting against the dark tattooed lines of his palm. Then he looked at her, and it was a different quality of looking than before. Before, she had been a woman in trouble, a variable, a problem presented to him by circumstance. Now she was something else. He doesn't want you back, Dallas said. It wasn't a question. No, Maureen said. Asterisk, he wants this. Asterisk, he held up the drive. He wants both, she said. Asterisk, me back. And this gone. In that order. Because a dead wife buried quietly is cleaner than a missing one who might still be talking. Asterisk. Dallas set the drive down on the desk between them. He picked up his bourbon and drank slowly, his eyes on the middle distance, recalculating something she couldn't see. You didn't come to me for shelter, he said finally. No, she admitted. His gaze returned to hers. Asterisk, you came to me because you needed someone Donald O'Brien couldn't buy, couldn't threaten, and couldn't outrun. Asterisk. Maureen held his eyes and said nothing, because that was the whole of it and they both already knew it. She slept 4 hours and woke up certain she was still in Donald's house. The ceiling was wrong. Too high, too dark, too quiet in the way of a place that had never hosted an argument. She lay still for a moment, mapping the unfamiliar geometry of the room, waiting for her pulse to understand what her eyes were telling it. Then the events of the previous night assembled themselves in sequence. The gala, the lounge, the bourbon spreading across dark wood, the thumb drive, the terminal glowing blue, and she sat up slowly into the gray morning light of a city that didn't know her name. Dallas was already awake. She could hear him somewhere in the penthouse, the low deliberate cadence of a phone call being conducted in the shorthand of men who operated without paperwork. She dressed in the clothes that had been left outside her door sometime in the night. Dark jeans, a black top, flat shoes in exactly her size. She didn't ask how he knew. She was beginning to understand that Dallas Townsley operated in a state of continuous preparation, and that preparedness for him was indistinguishable from control. She found him in the main room, phone already put away, standing at the far end of the space near the windows with a matte black handgun held loosely at his side. He wasn't pointing it at anything. He was simply holding it the way a man holds something that belongs to him, without drama, without self-consciousness, the way other men hold a cup of coffee. He looked at her once, took in the fact that she'd slept and dressed and walked toward him without being summoned, and something in the economy of his expression acknowledged it. Then he held the gun out to her, grip first. She stopped walking. The distance between them was maybe 6 feet and it felt like a cliff edge. I don't. I know, he said. Asterisk, take it anyway. Asterisk. She crossed the remaining distance and took it. The weight was immediate and wrong. Heavier than she'd expected. The metal cold in a way that traveled up through her palms and into her wrists. Her hands adjusted reflexively, gripping too hard, the knuckles whitening. Fear, Dallas said, watching her hands rather than her face. Asterisk, is a scent. Donald's men have been reading frightened women for years. They can smell it before you open your mouth, before you move, before you do anything at all. Asterisk, he paused. Asterisk, right now you smell like prey. That changes today. Asterisk. He moved behind her. Not quickly. Everything Dallas did was preceded by a telegraphed intention, as though he had decided long ago never to be the source of a flinch. She felt his presence at her back before she felt his hands, one closing over hers on the grip, adjusting the angle of her wrist by a few degrees that somehow changed the entire weight distribution of the thing. You're fighting it, he said, his voice close to her ear. Asterisk, don't fight the weight. It doesn't respond to that. Meet it. Asterisk. She exhaled, loosened her grip by a fraction. The gun settled differently in her hands. Still heavy. but purposefully so, like something that had agreed to work with her rather than against her. His foot moved to the inside of her heel, nudging her stance wider. His chest was an inch from her shoulder blades, and the warmth of him was a jarring contrast to the cold steel in her hands. She was acutely, uncomfortably aware of him, the controlled precision of his corrections, the way his breath moved at the edge of her peripheral vision, steady and measured where hers was still finding its rhythm. "Shoulders down," he said. You're waiting to be hit. Stop waiting. The observation landed somewhere accurate and uncomfortable. She lowered her shoulders. "Your husband taught you to brace," he continued, his voice carrying no particular heat, simply diagnosing. You learned to make yourself small before the impact arrived. That instinct will get you killed in a different context. Here, small is a target. Here, you take up space or you lose it. She adjusted, widened, held the weight differently, not absorbing it but meeting it the way he'd said. "Again," he said. Slide it back. She found the mechanism. The metallic clack of the slide rang through the quiet penthouse like a period at the end of a sentence she hadn't known she was writing. The sound was definitive in a way that surprised her, not violent but declarative. A small, irreversible statement. Dallas stepped back. She stood alone in the center of the room, the gun level, her stance wide, her shoulders down. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the windows. A woman in borrowed clothes holding something that didn't apologize for its weight. She barely recognized herself. Behind her, Dallas said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had shifted. Not softer exactly, but less clinical. Something beneath the instruction had changed frequency. "There she is," he said quietly. Neither of them acknowledged what he meant by it. Neither of them needed to. Came without warning, the way betrayals always do. A single chirp from the security panel, short, digital, almost polite, and then the monitors began going dark. Not all at once. One by one, each feed cutting to static in a sequence that moved through the system like a hand drawing a curtain. Dallas was on his feet before the third screen went black, his body making the decision before his mind had finished processing the information. Maureen watched him cross to the terminal in 4 steps and understood from the quality of his movement. Not rushed, but immediate, the way a soldier moves rather than a civilian, that this was not a technical failure. Someone had handed them over. "East Corridor," he said, already pulling the submachine gun from the hidden compartment beneath the desk. Move. Where? Now, Maureen. She moved. The first concussion grenade hit the balcony before she'd cleared the kitchen doorway. A white detonation that turned the world into a ringing, pressurized blank. She felt it in her back teeth. The floor shuddered. Dallas's hand found her shoulder and shoved her forward with a force that wasn't cruelty but had no room in it for hesitation. And she ran. The pantry. 3rd panel from the floor. She found it the way she'd found things in the dark in Donald's house. By feel, by memory. By the particular desperation of a woman who had learned to map every room she was trapped in. The grate came free in her hands, metal biting into her palms, and she hauled herself into the crawl space as the front doors of the penthouse came off their hinges, with a sound like the world rearranging its priorities. The ventilation shaft was tight and dark and smelled of cold machinery. She moved through it on her elbows and knees, the handgun Dallas had given her that morning pressed flat against her palm. The lesson from 2 hours ago, cycling through her muscles with a clarity that surprised her. Shoulders down. Meet the weight. Take up space or lose it. She reached the junction above the main hall and pressed her eye to the slats of the grate. Below her, the penthouse had become a different kind of room. Donald's mercenaries moved through it in tactical formation. Not the cheap muscle he sent to deliver messages, but professionals in dark gear with suppressed rifles and laser sights that drew thin red lines through the smoke still rolling from the blown entrance. They moved like men who had done this before and expected to be paid well for doing it again. Dallas was behind the kitchen island, using the marble as cover. She could see the dark stain spreading from his left shoulder. Not catastrophic, but real, the kind of real that slowed a man incrementally and eventually added up to permanent. His return fire was controlled and precise, each shot chosen rather than panicked, but she could see the math of it. His ammunition was finite. The men across the room were not, and two of them were moving. They came from the far side, using the destroyed entrance as cover, their boots muffled by the wreckage of what had been Dallas's front doors. They moved in a flanking arc toward the blind side of the island, the angle he couldn't watch without exposing himself. They were 30 seconds away from a position from which he would have no answer. Maureen's hands stopped shaking. She didn't decide so much as her body remembered what Dallas had told it that morning. She braced her elbows against the vibrating metal of the shaft. She aligned the sight through the narrow slats of the grate, the way she'd aligned it against the empty air of the penthouse a few hours ago when it had been theoretical. She thought about the weight. She met it. She squeezed the trigger. The sound inside the shaft was a physical thing. A blow against both eardrums that rattled her teeth and rang in her skull long after it was over. The first mercenary went down with his momentum still carrying him forward, a marionette with its strings cut. The second man spun toward the ceiling, confused, his rifle sweeping upward toward a threat he couldn't locate. It was enough. Dallas came up from behind the island in one surge, his weapon barking twice in the sudden window of the man's confusion. Clean. Decisive. The room went quiet the way rooms go quiet after something definitive has happened. Not gradually, but all at once, like a switch. Maureen lay in the shaft with her cheek against cold metal and her heart loud in her ears, listening to the hiss of the fire suppression system and the distant, indifferent sirens of a city that had no idea what had just happened 12 floors above its streets. Below her, Dallas stood among the wreckage of his fortress. His shoulder was bleeding. His breathing was controlled and deliberate. He turned slowly until he was looking up at the grate where she was hidden in the dark. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The way he looked at her said everything that needed saying and several things that didn't yet. She dropped out of the shaft and landed badly, one knee striking the floor hard enough to send a jolt up through her hip. She didn't stop moving. She crossed the wreckage of the main room, stepping over debris and around things she didn't let herself look at directly, and found the medical kit behind the hallway panel exactly where she'd cataloged it during her first methodical tour of the penthouse. The tour Dallas had noticed and not commented on. She'd been mapping exits. He'd been watching her map them. Neither had mentioned it. He was sitting on the edge of the slate sofa when she returned, his posture straight despite the shoulder, the economy of his suffering almost disciplined, as though even pain was something he refused to perform. She knelt in the space between his knees without being invited and without asking permission, and he went still but didn't pull away. She peeled back his shirt from the wound with careful hands. The bullet had torn a furrow through the deltoid, deep enough to matter, not deep enough to be the thing that ended him. She'd seen enough of Donald's particular brand of precise damage to know the difference between an injury designed to punish and one that had simply found its mark. She worked without speaking. Antiseptic first, which made the muscle beneath her fingers jump once and then hold absolutely rigid. as though he'd decided the reaction was inadmissible and corrected it. She pressed gauze to the wound with steady pressure and felt, with a dull and distant surprise, that her hands were not shaking. She had touched men in fear for 5 years. She had learned to move around Donald with the anxious, preemptive carefulness of someone navigating a room full of things that could break and would be her fault if they did. Every touch in that house had been a calculation. Every contact preceded by a rapid internal audit of his mood, his posture, the particular quality of his silence. Her hands on Dallas's shoulder were simply hands on a wound. Nothing braced beneath them, nothing waiting. The recognition of that absence arrived quietly and sat with her. "You're not what I expected," she said. She hadn't planned to say anything. Asterisk, what did you expect? Asterisk. Asterisk, less patience. Asterisk, she secured the gauze and sat back slightly on her heels. Asterisk, men with your kind of power usually don't bother with it. Asterisk. Something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, but adjacent. "Patience isn't a virtue in my world," he said. Asterisk, it's a tactic. The man who can wait longer than his opponent wins without firing. Asterisk, he paused. Asterisk, usually. Asterisk. Asterisk, and tonight. Asterisk. Asterisk. Tonight required a different approach. Asterisk, his eyes moved to hers. Asterisk, you provided it. Asterisk. She looked down at the medical kit in her hands, reorganizing items that didn't need reorganizing. "I almost didn't fire," she said. Asterisk, I had the angle. I had the time. I almost didn't do it anyway. Asterisk. Asterisk, but you did. Asterisk. Asterisk, I did. Asterisk. The fire suppression system had quieted. The penthouse held its damaged silence around them, smoke-hazed and strange. Dallas reached past her for his bourbon glass, somehow still upright on the far edge of the desk, untouched by the chaos, and drank once before setting it down between them like an offering. "East Side," he said without preamble. Asterisk, not the East Side people mean when they're being poetic about hard beginnings. The part that doesn't appear on the maps developers use. Asterisk, he looked at the windows, at the city burning below them. Asterisk, I learned to read by counting serial numbers on stolen crates. Learned to negotiate before I learned to write cursive. By 16 I understood that the only difference between the men giving orders and the men taking them was the willingness to hold a position until the other person broke. Asterisk, he was quiet for a moment. Asterisk, so I held every position. And I built walls. And I kept building them until nobody could reach in and take anything from me again. Asterisk. Maureen listened. She didn't offer the reflexive consolations that filled silences like this in polite company. She simply let what he'd said exist in the room at its actual size. "Donald didn't marry me," she said finally. Asterisk. I didn't understand that at first. I thought I did. I thought I was going in clear-eyed, practical, a transaction between adults. Asterisk, she looked at her hands. Asterisk, but a transaction implies two parties with agency. What Donald did was closer to acquisition. He bought a thing. He filed it under his name and maintained it and expected it to perform its function. Asterisk, she paused. Asterisk, the day I found those files, it wasn't shock I felt. It was recognition. Of course he ran his empire this way. He'd been running me the same way for years. People as inventory. Property with a pulse. Asterisk. Dallas looked at her for a long time. Not with pity. Not with the carefully managed sympathy of someone managing their response to difficult information. He looked at her the way she'd seen him look at the files on the terminal. taking the full measure of something, letting its actual dimensions settle. "You walked into that booth tonight with the drive already on you," he said. Asterisk, "You'd already decided." Asterisk, "Yes," she said. Asterisk, "You just needed someone Donald couldn't reach." Asterisk, "I needed someone," she said quietly, asterisk, "who understood that some walls aren't prisons. They're the only architecture that makes sense." Asterisk. Something in his face shifted then. Not open, never entirely open, but unlocked by a single degree. The distance between them had not changed. Everything else had. Came through every screen that still had power. Not a phone call. Not a message routed through intermediaries. A broadcast, simultaneous, deliberate, the kind of move that required preparation and therefore had been prepared before tonight's siege, which meant Donald had always intended for it to end here regardless of whether his mercenaries succeeded. The surviving monitors flickered in unison, and then his face filled each of them. Clean-shaven, composed. The philanthropist's smile sitting on his face like a coat he'd been wearing so long he'd forgotten it wasn't his skin. Maureen was still on the floor beside the sofa when it happened. She looked up at the screens and felt the specific quality of cold that Donald's face had always produced in her. Not the cold of fear exactly, but of foreclosure. The cold of a door swinging shut. He didn't waste words. He never had. Efficiency was one of the things she'd once mistaken for intelligence. Before she'd understood that in Donald's case it was simply the habit of a man who had always had people to clean up the parts of conversations he found tedious. The drive for her life. A simple exchange. The cathedral on the cliffs. He named it with the casual familiarity of a man who had conducted business there before, which she did not doubt for a moment. Tomorrow night. One representative each. No teams, no complications, no extensions. The broadcast ended. The screens held his absence for a moment before reverting to their damaged static. Dallas hadn't moved during any of it. He stood at the edge of the room with his arms crossed and his expression doing the thing it did when he was computing rather than reacting. That particular quality of stillness that looked like nothing was happening and was in fact the opposite. Then he uncrossed his arms and moved to the weapons cabinet with a quiet, terrible calm, and began to prepare. Maureen watched him work. He checked the primary weapon first, the full methodical sequence, each step performed with the practiced cadence of someone for whom this was as unremarkable as buttoning a shirt. Then the secondary piece at his ankle. Then the blade she hadn't known was there until he confirmed its position at the small of his back and moved on. He did it all without announcing it, without theater, in the matter-of-fact manner of a man who had accepted the terms of the evening and was simply getting ready. That was what reached her. Not the weapons. The acceptance. He wasn't preparing for a negotiation. He was preparing for a room full of men with instructions that ended in one outcome, and he had decided to walk into it anyway, and he had made that decision in approximately the time it took Donald's face to disappear from the monitors. She understood then, with a clarity that sat in her chest like cold water, that Dallas intended to walk through that cathedral door first, and that Donald, who had spent 5 years studying the architecture of control, had designed this particular trap with exactly that expectation. Dallas Townsley arriving alone, moving through the space with his particular gravity, drawing every eye and every rifle in the room, while someone else came in quietly through a side entrance to collect the drive from his body. The drive that Maureen was still carrying. She stood. She crossed to where his coat hung over the back of the desk chair. The same coat he'd slid across the lounge table toward her the night she'd spilled her bourbon and changed the entire trajectory of whatever remained of her life. She picked it up and put it on. Dallas turned. She met his eyes before he could speak. "He doesn't want you," she said. Asterisk, you're the obstacle. You're the thing he needs removed so he can get to me. Asterisk, she held his gaze steadily. Asterisk, if you walk through that door first, you'll be dead before you reach the altar. He'll have snipers in the balconies and men at every exit, and he will let you get far enough inside that retreat becomes impossible. Asterisk. Maureen. Asterisk. I'm going in first. Asterisk, she said it the way he'd said put it on the night they met. Not as a request, not as a negotiation. As a structural fact. Asterisk, he wants his moment. You know, men like Donald. They always want to see the thing they lost come walking back to them. It's the only part they can't outsource. Asterisk, she pulled the coat closer. Asterisk, he'll hold his hand when he sees me. He'll want to be the one to take it. That's the only window you'll get. And it only opens if I'm the one who walks through the door. Asterisk. Dallas looked at her for a long time. She could see him working through it. Not the emotion of it, but the tactical geometry, the sight lines, the sequence of variables. She could see the moment the geometry confirmed what she'd said. Because his jaw tightened in the way it tightened when he received information he would have preferred to argue with and couldn't. You understand what you're walking into, he said. I've been walking into rooms that wanted to swallow me for 5 years, Maureen said. Asterisk. The difference is this time I'm choosing the room. Asterisk. The cathedral smelled of candle wax and cold stone, and the particular sanctimony of a building that had spent centuries absorbing the confessions of people who intended to sin again before the week was out. Maureen walked its aisle alone. The doors had been heavy. Old oak reinforced with iron, the kind of doors built to communicate permanence. And they had groaned when she'd pushed through them, announcing her arrival to every person in the room, which was the point. She walked slowly, deliberately, her heels striking the stone floor in a rhythm that echoed up into the vaulted ceiling and came back to her diminished, as though the cathedral itself was absorbing the sound of her approach. Dallas's coat was gone. She'd left it in the car, because what she needed now was to look exactly like what Donald had always seen when he looked at her. The woman in the crimson dress. His returned. She kept her eyes forward and used them anyway. Balconies left and right, the carved stone railings running the length of the nave. She counted the shadows that were too still and too deliberate to be architectural. 3 on the left, 2 on the right. A 6th somewhere in the choir loft above the altar, where the darkness was deepest and the angle on the aisle was cleanest. She logged each one without moving her gaze and kept walking. Donald stood at the altar. He was impeccable. Of course he was. Dark suit, no tie, the studied casualness of a man who understood that the absence of formality in a formal space communicated power more effectively than ceremony. His hands were clasped in front of him, and his expression held that particular configuration she had spent 5 years learning to read. The philanthropist's smile with the boardroom beneath it. Warm on the surface, absolutely cold 6 inches down. She stopped 10 feet from him. The distance was deliberate, close enough to read his face, far enough that he couldn't close it without visible intention. Maureen, he said. Her name in his mouth was a form of ownership. It always had been. She simply hadn't had the language for it until recently. Asterisk, you look well. Asterisk, his eyes moved over her in that inventory way, cataloging condition and presentation. Asterisk, considering. Asterisk. Asterisk, Donald. Asterisk. Asterisk. I was worried about you. Asterisk, he said it with the practiced sincerity of a man who had delivered the line before and received good results. Asterisk, the company you've been keeping. The choices you've been making. Asterisk, he tilted his head slightly. Asterisk, you're not well, Maureen. You haven't been for some time. I think you know that. Asterisk. There it was. The opening move. The one he'd used every time she'd tried to leave, every time she'd found her voice. The gentle, concerned reframing of her perception as pathology. She had spent years shrinking under it, apologizing for the accuracy of her own observations. She reached into the neckline of her dress and held up the thumb drive. The smile didn't leave his face, but something behind it shifted. A pressure change, barely visible, like the moment before a weather system commits to what it's going to do. Here's what you need to understand, she said, and her voice came out level in a way that surprised even her. Asterisk. This drive is empty. Asterisk. A beat of silence. Asterisk. The files were uploaded 48 hours ago. Every port authority on the eastern seaboard. The federal prosecutor's office. 3 journalists whose editors have already been briefed. Asterisk. She held his gaze. Asterisk. The upload is linked to a confirmation code I enter every 5 minutes. If I don't enter it, if I can't enter it, the release triggers automatically. Asterisk. She paused. Asterisk. So the men in your balconies are decorative at this point. Asterisk. The philanthropist's smile left his face completely. What remained underneath was something she recognized from the coat room of the gala, from the closed door of his study, from every room in their life that had no witnesses. The face he kept for private use. You're bluffing, he said. You taught me, she said, asterisk, that a bluff only fails if the other person is willing to test it. Asterisk. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. Asterisk. Are you willing to test it, Donald? Asterisk. The silence that followed had a texture to it. Thick, pressurized. The silence of a man running calculations that kept returning the wrong answer. She watched it move through him. Watched the golden architecture of 5 years of careful construction begin to develop cracks along load-bearing walls. His hand moved toward his jacket. The first shot came from the choir loft. It came from the dark, precise and without ceremony, the way Dallas did everything. The shadow to Donald's left dissolved. The cathedral erupted, not into chaos exactly, but into the violent rearrangement of a plan meeting its dissolution point. Maureen dropped behind the altar step as the nave above her came alive with movement. She pressed her back to the cold stone and breathed, counting seconds, entering the confirmation code with steady thumbs while the world above her made its loud, irreversible decisions. Somewhere in the rafters, Dallas was moving. She had done her part. Now she waited to see what remained when the noise stopped. He ran. That was the thing about men like Donald. When the architecture of their control finally collapsed, when the last wall came down and the room they'd built to contain the world stopped holding, they ran. All the composure, all the tailored patience, all the carefully maintained stillness of a man who had never once needed to flee anything. It evaporated in the time it took the first shot to find its mark. He went through the side door before the echo had finished moving through the nave, and Maureen heard his footsteps on the stone passage beyond it. Fast, graceless, stripped of the deliberate elegance he wore like a second suit. She came up from behind the altar step and followed. Not because she had to, not because the plan required it. Because something in her had decided, in the cold quiet behind the altar stone while the cathedral sorted itself out above her, that she was not going to let this end in a room she hadn't chosen. She had walked into this building on her own terms. She was going to walk out of it the same way. The passage led to a service exit, and the service exit led to the cliffs, and the cliffs led down a rusted iron staircase to the pier that jutted out over the Atlantic like a sentence that had stopped believing in punctuation. The rain had returned. Not the deluge of previous nights, but a steady, purposeful rain that made the timber slick and turned the dock lights into smeared impressions of themselves. The ocean below was black and loud, working itself against the pilings with the indifferent persistence of something that had been here long before any of this and fully intended to remain. Donald was at the far end of the pier when she came through the staircase gate. He'd stopped running. There was nowhere left to go. The railing at the pier's end, the churning black water below, and the growing constellation of blue and red lights beginning to crawl across the city's skyline behind her. She could hear the sirens now, a low morning sound that meant the night's events had finally reached the attention of people whose job it was to respond to them. Too late to be useful, as institutions usually were when Donald O'Brien was involved, but arriving nonetheless. He turned when he heard her footsteps on the wet timber. His face in the docklight was a different face than the one she'd stood 10 feet from in the cathedral. The philanthropist was entirely gone. What remained was older and less constructed and considerably more dangerous. A man with nothing left to protect except the fundamental refusal to be the one who lost. "You," he said. The single syllable carrying everything 5 years had accumulated between them. "Me," she agreed. Behind her, she heard Dallas on the staircase. Measured, unhurried. A man who had already assessed the geometry of the pier and determined he was not needed urgently. He came through the gate and stopped. He didn't move forward. She understood without turning that he was reading the situation the way he read every situation, determining where the weight was, deciding whether to apply his own or let someone else's do the work. He let hers do the work. Donald's eyes moved between them, and she watched him arrive at the calculation she'd known he would eventually reach. The one where the most damage he could still accomplish was the damage done to her. His hand moved to his jacket. Not the holster. Something smaller. A ceramic blade, flat and thin, the kind that didn't announce itself to security equipment. She'd seen it once before, years ago, in his desk drawer, and had filed the information away in the part of herself that had always been quietly preparing for the night his other methods stopped feeling sufficient. He moved fast. Faster than she'd expected from a man who had spent 5 years having other people be fast on his behalf. He covered the distance between them with the lurching, committed momentum of someone who had decided this was the only move remaining on the board. She didn't step back. She stepped in. The years of watching him, the particular way he led with his right shoulder, the way his weight transferred when he was certain of his target, the slight drop of his chin that preceded every moment when he believed he'd already won. All of it lived in her body now, mapped into her reflexes by 5 years of necessary observation. She caught his wrist with both hands, turned into the momentum rather than against it, and used the full committed weight of his certainty to redirect him toward the railing. There was a single beat of suspension, his face close to hers, shock replacing conviction in real time, and then the railing took him, and the Atlantic took him from the railing, and the waves closed over Donald D. O'Brien with the absolute, unsentimental finality of water doing what water does. No one reached for him. Maureen stood at the railing and looked down at the black water and breathed. The rain fell on her shoulders. The sirens grew louder at her back. Behind her, Dallas's footsteps crossed the wet timber and stopped beside her. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold, not touching, simply present. The ocean said nothing. It had already moved on. The new safe house was smaller than the penthouse. Dallas had taken her there without explanation. A different building, a different elevation, a different configuration of rooms that told a different story about the man who maintained it. There were still no photographs. There was still the careful, deliberate absence of anything that could be used to read him. But the ceilings were lower here, and the furniture had been chosen with something closer to consideration, and the balcony that ran along the eastern face looked out over the city at an angle that felt less like surveillance and more like watching. Small differences. She noticed them the way she'd spent 5 years noticing small differences, because small differences were where the truth lived. The city below them didn't know yet. That was the strange part. Standing above it and watching it conduct its ordinary 3 a.m. business, the late cabs and the lit windows and the arterial glow of streets that never fully went dark, and understanding that somewhere in its foundations something structural had shifted tonight without its knowledge. The files were already moving through the systems she'd set them moving through. By morning, the name Donald D. O'Brien would begin its long, irreversible transformation from philanthropist to subject. The process would take months, would involve lawyers and prosecutors and journalists and the slow grinding machinery of institutions that moved poorly but eventually moved. It would not be clean. It would not be fast. But it would happen. She knew it the way she knew the ocean below the pier had already forgotten him. She stood at the balcony railing with her hands resting loose on the metal and looked out over the lights. She wasn't scanning. That was the thing she noticed first. The absence of the thing she'd been doing without realizing she was doing it for 5 years. The constant peripheral monitoring, the automatic cataloging of exits and angles and the emotional weather of every room she entered. The low, continuous hum of threat assessment that had become so habitual she'd stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing a sound that never stops. It was quiet now. Not gone, perhaps. She was not naive enough to believe one night on a pier could undo 5 years of necessary wiring. But quiet. Receded to a distance where it was no longer the loudest thing in the room. She was simply looking at the city, at the lights, at the mist the rain had become, drifting soft and directionless through the glow of the street lamps below, turning everything at the edges soft and amber and provisional. It was, she realized, the first time in years she had looked at something simply because it was there. Dallas stood behind her. She hadn't heard him come out. He moved the way he always moved, without announcing himself, but she felt his presence the way she'd felt it since the lounge, as a specific quality of warmth and mass and attention at the edge of her awareness. He didn't speak. He'd been doing that since the pier, allowing the silence to exist at its natural size rather than filling it with the management of her reaction, which was the thing Donald would have done. Donald had never been able to tolerate an unmanaged silence. They made him feel unobserved. Dallas seemed, if anything, most himself when no one was performing. The mist moved through the light below them. A cab turned a corner 12 floors down, and its headlights swept briefly across a wet intersection and disappeared. Then his hand settled on her shoulder. It came slowly. She felt the intention of it before the contact. The careful telegraphing she'd come to understand was simply how he moved through the world when he was choosing not to be what the world had made him. His palm rested against the curve of her shoulder, warm through the fabric, neither gripping nor directing. Not a claim, not a correction, not the prelude to anything that required her compliance or her performance or her careful recalibration of herself around the needs of someone else's certainty. Simply a hand. Simply his warmth. Simply the wordless communication of a man who was standing beside her in the specific way that meant he had chosen to be there and was not asking her to be anywhere other than where she was. She waited for the flinch. It didn't come. She stood in the mist above the city that didn't know yet what had happened in its cathedral and on its pier, with the warmth of Dallas's hand on her shoulder and the quiet in her chest where the hum used to be, and she breathed. In slow and full and belonging entirely to her. Not the breath of a woman managing her visibility. Not the breath of a woman calculating the emotional temperature of the room. Not the careful, rationed breath of someone who had learned to take up as little air as possible in spaces that didn't want her in them. just a breath. Hers. The first of whatever came next. Below them, the city glittered on in its unknowing, and the mist kept falling, and Maureen J. Wilkins. Not the trophy, not the acquisition, not the woman in the crimson dress running from the ruins of a life that had never been hers. Stood in the quiet and let the night be exactly what it was. Enough. Finally, after everything, simply enough. Show your respect by hitting that like button, subscribe to join the family, and drop a comment below to let the commission know your thoughts on today's hit.